You know, John, I try not to ask too much of our audience, but
But there's always a but.
yeah, remember people tell you that if somebody says to you, you know, you look great, but don't believe anything before but.
There you go.
But you can believe this, my friends, if you listen and you come back time and again because you love the topics, the approach, looking forward at social and political issues. Could you do us a solid? What do you think this is, John, that I'm asking?
I think you're asking for them to, wherever they listen, to give us a good review.
Ah, yes, John. 5 stars.
Which is
would do it.
important. Which is important.
Yeah, that's all we're looking for, is the highest review you can possibly give for a podcast that you come back to time and again. Is that too much to ask, John?
No, I think that's a nice thing to do.
So whether it's Apple or Google or Spotify or TuneIn Radio, wherever it is that you're listening, please, if you could, give us a great review, because that will help us and it will position us in the constellation of so many podcasts in such a way that you and others can find us more easily.
Yeah, we'll be right up front where you can find us. You don't have to go hunting.
Absolutely.
Searching.
And don't forget to check out the MHNR network. And we're right there because we've joined this new network and we're thrilled to be a part of it. Again, MHNRnetwork.com.
And if you click on where it says shows, I think we're the second or third one down, America Trends.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And remember, 5 stars.
What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin and John Krofsik. And John, you and I have explored this particular issue tangentially in the past, but we're going to confront it head on in this podcast. Why can't America, with the strongest military, spending and outspending the rest of the world on defense, why can't we win a war in the last 50 years?
I don't think we have the stomach to win a war. I don't think you know, you look what's happening in the Middle East. In order for us to win out there, we got to outlast them, and they're not going anywhere.
Well, they do have a different perspective on time than we do, honestly. But, you know, the truth of the matter is that maybe we haven't understood the nature of the conflicts that we've been getting into lately, and we're fighting the new battles with our old strategies and tactics, and they're not working any longer. How does that sound?
That sounds good to me. I don't understand why we're in.
Are you going to make me the commander-in-chief?
That's right, we should, because I don't understand why we're in half the places we're in the world anyhow. I mean, we get ourselves into what seem to be, you know, maybe like civil wars, and we insert ourselves in there, and then, you know, we're stuck.
Yeah, and sometimes we come out with a result that is even lesser than the terrible evils that had been perpetrated upon the people, regrettably. And then they don't like America for a very long time. Well, there is a book out by John Caldwell, Anatomy of Victory. And again, the subtitle is Why the United States Triumphed in World War II. Okay, so that was something that we held on to dearly, saying we saved the world in many ways from the scourge of Hitler and the like. We fought to a stalemate in Korea. And by the way, there's no armistice there.
Right.
That's still
going
kind of
on.
a hot, cold war.
Right.
We lost in Vietnam, clearly, and we failed in Iraq. So in one, we fought to a stalemate. One, we lost. One, we failed. And we just don't seem to really have the magic formula any longer.
Well, I don't think we had. I mean, we understood that Hitler was taking over the world and that we had to do something. I don't know if we knew why we were in Vietnam, and I still don't know why we are in Afghanistan and, Iran and Iraq and that whole this whatever else, Syria.
Wait a minute. When you said I ran, was that you talking about my military record, John? I mean,
You
where I
ran on that?
Yeah, and I backed up and I ran. Is that what you're talking about? Well, listen. John Caldwell is a very serious guy, a very thoughtful guy, and he looks at the architecture that is necessary to be put in place before we begin to give up our treasure, our military treasure, our people, our resources, all of our armament. And we don't seem to have strategic architecture any longer when we go in. And I've got to tell you, listen for the story that he tells about Vietnam. It's fascinating how when he was studying what was going on there when he was there, what an individual told him, no matter what he saw around him, how hopeless this venture was. And you'll understand exactly what he's talking about. So let's get to him right now. There is perhaps no more important topic on foreign relations in America than why we continue to make the mistakes that we do, and they're so costly in so many ways. Anatomy of Victory, John Caldwell. Today on America Trends. On the line with us on America Trends is John Caldwell. The book is called Anatomy of Victory: Why the United States Triumphed in World War II, Fought to a Stalemate in Korea, Lost in Vietnam, and Failed in Iraq. And, you know, that's a question that many people have, John. What has gone wrong of late where America just can't seem to finish a conflict and declare victory, though we have done that prematurely, at least in one case. But tell us why you decided to write this book and how difficult it would be to dissect the elements that made one war a success and the others not so much.
Well, the impetus for this probably began 50 years ago. My first real job was in Saigon, starting in March of 1968 when I was working for a think tank that was based in Goleta, California, that's just north of Santa Barbara, and they had a contract with the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the Department of Defense to study village defense in Vietnam. And so I was part of the team that was deployed to the field to do that. And about a week after I arrived in Saigon, I met a young officer from the Harvard class of 1965. He was an ROTC guy. He was a lieutenant, and he had already served 2 combat tours in Vietnam. And he was a Vietnamese speaker, which was unusual in those days. In fact, it still is. And he was back in Vietnam as a civilian because he wanted to understand what was really going on when he was there, because he didn't. And so he came back as a civilian to research it and ended up writing one of the best books on the Vietnam War that exists. It came out in 1973 and was published by the University of California Press. But I'm getting ahead of the story. Less than 5 minutes into our conversation after we met, he looks at me and he says, "John, we're going to lose this war." And I said, "Jeffrey, how can you possibly make a statement like that? I mean, look around you. We've got 550,000 men here. We've got 10 divisions. We've got offshore naval power that is overwhelming, aircraft carriers with fighter bombers that can fly on a moment's notice. If the shooting were to stop tomorrow, it would take us 5 years to pack up and go home. There's so much stuff out here and so many people." And he just looked at me very levelly and said, "Our enemies have a theory of victory, and we don't." And that sort of stuck.
Now, we didn't have a theory of victory in Vietnam. Why did we continue to get into these skirmishes and these wars without that going forward? Because really, you look at it, Vietnam was only the beginning. I mean, Iraq, of course, and just a lot of adventures in the Middle East, Afghanistan. Why have we not learned from that failure? And what should we have learned from World War II?
Well, I think it goes something like this. To sort of jump ahead, on page 431 of my book, I sort of come up with what I call 4 simple imperatives. And they sound very simple and commonsensical, but they're very difficult to do. and they go like this. Number one, define a successful geopolitical outcome in keeping with American core interest, and then plan backwards. That is, if you're going to mount a military expeditionary mission in some remote part of the world, in a place, for example, like Vietnam. And second, define a strategy as a sequence of political and military operations to get to the end state you want to achieve. And if statesmen and generals cannot do this, or if the range of acceptable alternatives cannot be defined or is unknowable, the enterprise may very well be a hostage to fortune and likely doomed. The third thing is, if you do have a strategy, then you need to define a set of executable plans for the sequence of operations and specify the resources that are necessary to get to the goal you want to achieve. And if a government isn't prepared to do that at the outset, it risks failure. And when statesmen and generals think a conflict might be protracted, requiring a long game, defining an exit strategy is an oxymoron, because exit is what happens after governments and armies prevail and win. That's when Americans come home. And that's why, in my book at least, World War II is such a compelling benchmark. And the last thing you want to do is execute plans where comprehensive whole-of-government operations and resources are identified in detail with realistic schedules. And successful execution means a very well thought out end game to do that. Now, all of that sounds sort of like a checklist and very easy to do, but in truth, it's very, very hard to do.
And obviously, we have not been doing that of late. I love the way, though, you describe Winston Churchill. And I just saw a movie about Churchill. And when you watch that film, it was remarkable because you said he's coming in at a late moment in time. He's got so much working against him. Hitler seems to be on the march. I mean, how could he believe that his policy was to wage war on land, sea, and air, and our goal is victory? I mean, but that was so important as a precept to Britain holding off Hitler for as long as they did. And, of course, Hitler making some mistakes didn't hurt either.
That's right. Well, if you think about the late spring of 1940 and the 10th of May when Churchill became Prime Minister of England, succeeding Neville Chamberlain, who had lost a vote of confidence in the House of Commons. That very same day is when Hitler invaded the Low Countries and France and Belgium. And within 6 weeks, it was essentially all over. And 3 days into his premiership, Churchill's in the House of Commons answering the question, what is our policy? And you've said it. His answer was to wage war on land, sea, and air with all our might. And he went on to say, what is our aim? And he said, it is victory, for without victory there is no survival. But at that point, Churchill couldn't really have had in his mind any clear conception of what a theory of victory was. So this was rhetoric. It was eloquent rhetoric. It was defiant, but it would take some considerable time before Churchill was able, with allies, to develop a theory of victory.
And of course, he frustrated Hitler because he couldn't win the Battle of Britain, and therefore Hitler looked for a second target, and that's where he got mired in Russia.
Exactly right. I mean, Churchill figured that Britain was in no position to mount some kind of counteroffensive to reverse all of the disasters that had occurred. But he was in a position, Churchill thought, to sort of fight the Luftwaffe to a standstill during the Battle of Britain. And it turned out, and this is something Churchill knew in advance, because he was a student of military affairs and was extremely well informed, had been a soldier himself, of course, and he knew that in many ways the Royal Air Force and Fighter Command in particular was probably the best prepared fighter force in the world to fight the defensive mission it had to fight, which was to defend the skies over southern England, to make it impossible for the Luftwaffe, the German Luftwaffe, to achieve air supremacy, which would be a precondition to any possibility of an invasion. So I think Churchill reasoned that if he could fight during the weeks and months of the summer with fighter command as a lethal force capable of shooting down Luftwaffe bombers and fighters, and stay in being to be able to do that, they would eventually give up because they would be getting very little gain for lots of sacrifices. And that's, in truth, what happened. But it wasn't all that simple a thing. But
by no means.
That's the way it played out.
But I think the world has to thank Churchill for the rhetoric, for the bombast, even if he didn't really know what would underpin a victory necessarily, and holding off until, of course, the United States got into this and the alliance with Russia and the like. But with all that said, how important is civilian leadership in all of this? We had a guest on, about a year ago who suggested that America has been, done in often by very bad leadership at the top in the recent period in terms of our presidents who act as commanders-in-chief. What's your take on that?
I don't actually talk about it explicitly in my book, but leadership is vital. Civilian leadership, as well as military leadership, they have to work together, but they need, particularly presidents, I think, or prime ministers for that matter, need to know how to ask the right kinds of questions. And I think it goes back to those imperatives that I mentioned at the outset. If you are prepared to define a geopolitical outcome where victory is your goal, then you need to think through a whole sequence of things that have to happen in order to achieve that, and that requires real leadership. There are almost some functional things that you sort of have to think about. Supreme leaders can set direction. They can pick winning generals, and that's a skill all by itself. And they need to be prepared to fire them. I mean, Lincoln fired 7 commanders of the Army of the Potomac, example, before he found Grant. They need to be on top of things in terms of being able to execute things and to have hands-on control over the government institutions that need to be put in place to succeed. And above all, they need to know how to communicate effectively to the constituencies they need, both domestic and international, to prevail. And therefore, they need really good communication skills, because if you really want to succeed, at some point, you're going to have to communicate all of this in a very well thought out, well-reasoned rationale that explains all of this to the American people.
So let's transfer some of the military leadership that we had in World War II ultimately to Vietnam, let's say. And there, the U.S., we had no understanding of how the society worked. In World War II, a conventional war, we won by driving forces off of land, more traditional security. And yet here, it was very difficult for us really to hold on to land, and it had a different meaning in a place like Vietnam.
Yes. Well, I think a lot of it had to do with, initially, understanding the kind of conflict we were getting ourselves into. And it's worth bearing in mind, I think, that the kind of army we deployed to Vietnam was very much organized the way our World War II armies were. Indeed, many of the men who led in Vietnam, at least initially, were World War II veterans. They had seen the doctrines with which they had fought, proven time and again. I mean, you take an officer like William Westmoreland, for example. He had served as an artillery officer in North Africa. He was at the Battle of Kasserine Pass. He had artillery units that were able to sort of save the day at one point in a tactical engagement that prevented Kasserine Pass from becoming a complete rout. Later he served in Italy and at one point had a jeep completely blown out from underneath him and kept right on going. He served in Korea as an airborne officer. I mean, this was a man who had considerable combat experience. And he had seen himself as a commander of troops that the doctrine of which we had, been fighting actually since U.S. Grant developed it in the Civil War was sort of, find, fix, fight, and finish the enemy decisively. I mean, that's how the American military had always fought when it deployed anywhere, and especially overseas. It's certainly how we fought the Civil War, for example, where we incurred enormous casualties. And both sides did. And in the case of Vietnam, these officers had seen this concept proven, and they weren't people who were trained to question something that worked. Why would you? And so if you wanted to understand what was happening in Vietnam, you had to step back a little bit and ask yourself this question. Why have we got an army deployed here that can't find, fix, or fight the enemy in any sort of decisive battle? Because Westmoreland spent most of his time when he was there, searching and trying to frame the battlefield for a decisive battle, which he never got. And it happened literally hundreds and hundreds of times, search and destroy operations of this kind. And so you needed to sort of step back and perhaps ask this question: how does an army find, fight, fix, and finish the enemy whose language it cannot speak, whose history it knows very little about, and whose culture and tradition and customs it knows even less about, and begin to come to grips with a problem that way and say, why are we here and what are we trying to accomplish? And I think that might have led us to think that what we had to do was think about helping a nation, South Vietnam, try and achieve its own capability, which really meant we were in the business of trying to change behaviors. And so one might argue that a successful strategic architecture in Vietnam might have required American and South Vietnamese agreement on getting four things sort of aligned together. The first would have to be a clearly stated policy that made a compelling case to both the American and the South Vietnamese people for why the government of Vietnam, that is in South Vietnam, deserved such a massive American national commitment to nation building, because that was still a respectable word in those years, and where we were prepared, as we did, to sacrifice nearly 60,000 American lives. That, number one. Number two, you needed a political strategy to go with that undermined the communist revolutionary movements, preemptive social and economic policies, with policies of your own that were at least as compelling and preemptive in the areas of things like land reform, taxes, military recruitment, administrative staffing. It's a long list.
Right, and we never really had that, right? I mean, we had no understanding of how this society worked. It was a black box, and we didn't make friends because we went in with a very violent approach, and we didn't realize what Ho Chi Minh was doing in the North to really analyze every village, every area, the way they understood their own people, and the way he would win by not losing. That was just so foreign to us.
Well, we tried. And in some ways, you could even argue we tried heroically. I mean, we had what was called MACV, that was an acronym that stood for Military Assistance Command Vietnam. And by 1967, we had created an organization that had the most extraordinary name, CORDS, that was called Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Systems. This, all of it attached to a Theater J staff, meaning a major organization, and it had 8,000 people in it, consisting of State Department people, USAID people, CIA officers, military people from all of the services. It had liaison with the Army of Vietnam, and it reached out to dozens of government of Vietnam agencies. But essentially, it became kind of a well-funded, one could argue reasonably well-administered program, but essentially where it was sort of, almost like a government in parallel, but it wasn't really influencing and changing South Vietnamese behavior. By that I mean, the behavior of South Vietnamese leaders ranging from politicians to military guys all the way down to lieutenants.
And
in some cases we did.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, and those in North Korea, I mean, they understood that Americans, seeing on television all these boys returning in body bags, that we would not tolerate this for long. And they had withstood others, like the French, in the past. So they understood us, perhaps, better than we understood them. But I want to move on because, we know about the, failure in Vietnam. But why would we not have learned from Vietnam that these asymmetrical wars were so difficult for the training and the approach that America took to warfare? Why did we not learn more about that as it relates to Iraq and even Afghanistan at this moment in time?
Well, that's a very good question. And the simple answer is, I think after sort of 1975, we were saying to ourselves, nation building is not something we know how to do very well. And therefore, if we're going to get involved abroad where sort of heavy lifting is involved with respect to, major combat operations, we have to go in with a doctrine that says, almost like World War II, get it over with quickly, get it over with decisively, and pack up and go home. And if you think to what we started to do for the last quarter century in Iraq, that's in fact what we did. I sort of divide up the Iraqi war, if you want to call it that, into actually 5 separate wars. And the first one was the Persian Gulf War that occurred in 1990-91 when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And George H.W. Bush, a World War II veteran himself, wisely concluded that what we needed to do was to intervene there, liberate Kuwait, and then go home. But as a result of succeeding in doing that, there were some loose ends because Saddam survived and was able to claim that he won by not losing. And so we had a 13-year air war that sort of festered between the spring of 1991 and 2003 when the president's younger son, George W. Bush, invaded Iraq a second time. And again, the fighting was all over in essentially less than a month. We were in Baghdad. But we didn't have a plan at that point for what we were going to do next, which is something that we had forgotten about in terms of the lessons of World War II. Because if you think back to 1945, after the Axis enemies had all signed surrender instruments on the dotted line, what did we do? We led a very well executed and financed recovery program that lasted longer than the war itself and cost almost as much based on, current estimates. I have a few of them in my book. And the highest number that somebody computed was something on the order of $886 billion. That's almost $1 trillion. That's a lot of money. And we expended those kinds of resources because we knew that it made sense to enable our former enemies to rejoin the international system as peaceable democratic states.
And as customers for an American manufacturing, capability that was unparalleled at that moment in time, having never really suffered much in the way of damage on our own homeland.
Exactly, and we were the only industrial power left standing that hadn't sustained massive damage, and therefore we needed markets. And the only way to, rebuild those markets and succeed with international markets was to help our former enemies recover. And if you think back to things like the European Recovery Program, which was famously known as the Marshall Plan, these occupations that then evolved into recovery programs became hugely successful and essentially laid the foundation for the international system that we're still living with and benefiting from today.
Absolutely. John Caldwell, Anatomy of Victory, a fascinating book and very detailed about the various wars that we have been in. I've got to ask you, because just yesterday there was a syndicated columnist, Robert Samuelson, and he wrote, the most undercovered story in Washington, D.C. these days is the loss of U.S. military power, a lesson particularly important in light of the resignation of Defense Secretary Jim Mattis. And he's basically saying that we are starting to lose our grip on this military superiority. He thinks that we have not funded the military appropriately, but he also thinks that we have not looked at the seriousness of the advancements made by China and Russia and their determination to establish their dominance in various regions. What do you say to that?
I think that all makes eminently good sense. We certainly need to pay close attention to potential adversaries like China. I mean, we trade with China in the trillions of dollars. We have other trading partners with whom we do a lot, but China is one of our biggest economic partners now, but it's also an economic rival, a political rival, a geopolitical rival. And we need to pay attention to those things because the Chinese are very aggressive and they're very confident. And they've got technological capabilities that eventually are going to be able to compete with ours. And probably the most telling point of all is it's going to happen in the next probably 4 to 5 years. China's GDP is going to be larger than ours. Now, that may not be, thought of in terms of, the wealth on a per capita basis because China has a much bigger population. But the point is China is catching up with us at very high speed. Who 40 years ago could have predicted anything like this?
Well, when I read from what is a congressionally required National Defense Strategy Commission, and that's this group of civilian experts, retired military officers, and to quote from their report, America has reached the point of a full-blown national security crisis. How much have we squandered in these various conflicts of no determinate end to bring us to this point?
Well, I think you need to separate the two things apart from one another. I mean, if you look at it from, say, the point of view of the Chinese, they're perfectly happy to see us tied down in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and even other parts of the world. But at the same time that they see us tied down, they are, in fact, making investments in Iraq, and especially in Afghanistan, as countries where they are expanding their economic influence in the very places we are trying to help. And American businesses are not there in anything like the presence that the Chinese are. I learned that at a seminar that I attended about 3 or 4 years ago, and was astonished to learn that. And that's something we should be very, very concerned about. Because what it's really telling us is that American businesses are much more risk-averse than Chinese companies are. They're willing to take risks. They're willing to buy copper mines in Afghanistan in a way that our companies aren't, for example. They are looking at it for the long term, and they are doing this on a global basis. They aren't simply making these investments in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. They're also doing it in Iraq. In fact, they're doing it all over the world. They're doing it in Latin America.
If we had a major decision maker listening to this program today, after all the research that you did for your book, Anatomy of Victory, and they were thinking of deploying American military resources someplace, what would you say to them at this moment about the caution that they need to use in that process and the various factors that they need to include in their analysis?
I think I'd take them back to the imperatives, which I actually derived from having done this study and all the research that I did for my book, which took several years. And that's the 4 things. Define a successful geopolitical outcome. Define a strategy that is realistic to achieving the goal that you're trying to achieve. Come up with executable plans and then find people who know how to execute those plans effectively. That's very hard to do. And if you can't figure out a way to do that, that you're going to be able to sell to the American people, then proceed very cautiously and figure out what you really do need to do. Because you don't want to get yourself involved in an overseas expedition that's headed for failure because you haven't thought it through. Easy to say all of these things, and you've always got to be prepared for the unexpected, and you've got to be able to adapt to the unforeseen, as we had to in World War II, as we had to in Korea, as we should have done in Vietnam, and as in fact General Petraeus did during the surge in Iraq. If you think these things through, you can make some headway.
All right, John Caldwell, thank you so much for this book. It really is a tremendous historical account. Anatomy of Victory: Why the United States Triumphed in World War II, Fought to a Stalemate in Korea, Lost in Vietnam, and Failed in Iraq. Thank you so much for joining us today on America Trends.
Larry, I'm most grateful for you inviting me. Thank you.
You're listening to America Trends Podcast, and we're part of the Mental Health News Radio Network at mhnrnetwork.com.